Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Eidus, Perik Yud Zayin, Halacha Zayin. Haseicher Eidus Sheker L'Hoyed L'Chaverei. Someone hires false witnesses to testify for his fellow. Pata B'dinei Adam, Chayiv B'dinei Shemayim. So the courts cannot force him to pay. He's exempted in the laws of man, literally translated. It means the courts have no jurisdiction. But he's liable in the laws of heaven, which simply means that God will hold him accountable. The same thing with a witness who withholds his testimony and doesn't testify. Only one witness. He's exempted from the laws of man. In other words, the courts can't punish him. But he's liable by the hands of Hashem. So the question here is, when we talk about the witnesses, the false witnesses, they cause someone the loss of money. The courts can't force you to pay. But the question is, when we say that you're chayiv b'dinei shemayim, you're liable by the hands of heaven, does that mean that you are obligated to pay? There is a financial obligation. It's just that the courts don't have the authority to collect it. But it's really an obligation, a financial obligation on you. That's one side of the question. On the other hand, it could be that no, there's absolutely no financial obligation for you to pay, but Hashem will hold you accountable and you'll be punished by Hashem. And if you pay, you'll get rid of that punishment, but there's no obligation to actually pay. What's the practical difference between these two approaches? So there's a sefer called Shari Torah that deals with the laws of witnesses and other aspects of Jewish law. And he says that this is the dispute between two of the early Achreinim, the Maharal Mints and the Maharshal. The Maharal Mints writes that even though the courts don't have the power to have you pay, but you could use verbal coercion. In other words, the courts can't actually confiscate your property to pay up for the loss, for the damages, but they could use coercion, verbal coercion. They could announce in the synagogue that this person is not going to pay for something that caused the damage that he caused, embarrassment, a form of excommunication, and that will cause the person to pay. That the courts do have the power to do. Why would the courts have the power to do that? Because Maharal Mints follows the approach, obviously, that there is a financial obligation that can't be enforced by the courts. But it doesn't mean there is no financial obligation. There is a financial obligation. So as long as you're not using actual coercion and confiscation of his property, you're just causing him to be embarrassed so that he'll comply, that you can do. But the Marshal, who doesn't bring the Maharal Mints, and the Shari Torah is a little puzzled why he doesn't bring him, Marshal says clearly you cannot use any kind of coercion, not even verbal coercion. So it's obvious that the Marshal holds that there is no financial obligation. It's just a spiritual thing. And the only thing is you can get rid of the spiritual accountability if you do pay, but you have no obligation whatsoever to pay. It's just a matter of getting punished for not paying. And the Shari Torah says that the Maharal Mints and the Marshal are consistent with their views because they also maintain another dispute that hinges on this first dispute. What is the other dispute? What happens if the person who was harmed seizes the property of the person who caused them the harm, the person who hired the witnesses, the false witnesses, and he seizes his property? So the Maharal Mints says, in that case, he can keep it. The Marshal says, no, he can't keep it. Well, that's the same argument. If there's an actual financial obligation, it's just they can't be enforced by the courts, but the person already seized it, and it's his. He's legally obligated to pay him, so the victim really has ownership of it. It's just he can't get the courts to do it, but if he did it himself, he has the authority to keep it. The Marshal, on the other hand, says, no, he has no such authority. There is no financial obligation. There's a moral obligation, but not a financial obligation. And in that case, if he seizes it, unlawfully. Now, Tosfos in Bava Kama Daf Nun Vav writes that when the Halacha that the Rambam brings, that if you hire a false witnesses, you're liable in the hands of heaven. So Tosfos says that's only if you hired someone. But if you just tell someone, do me a favor, I'm not going to pay you for this, but I want you to testify falsely, he's not liable at all. And the Shach, in Chesed Mishpat, Simon Lamed Beis, says, how could that be? The Gemara in Kedushin, Af Mem Beis, says if a person tells another person to kill someone, he is liable by the hands of heaven. So you see, just saying without hiring is enough. The Ketzos, there in Chesed Mishpat, Simon Lamed Beis, says that the obligation to fulfill your obligation to Hashem, that is an actual financial obligation. And therefore, when is there a financial obligation? When you actually hired the witnesses. That makes you liable. But if you just tell someone, then your liability is only a moral liability, not a legal one. So the Gemara in Kedushin that says you're liable doesn't mean you're actually liable. If you tell someone to kill someone, there it means that you are morally liable and you're subject to penalty for the hands of heaven. Now the Chiddushei Harim in Chesed Mishpat brings a proof from the Rambam that the Rambam holds that there is a financial obligation. And therefore, when the Rambam here says if someone hires false witnesses to testify, he's exempted from the Bezdin, they can't enforce it, but you are liable, meaning that you do have a financial obligation, but it's a moral obligation. It can't be enforced by the courts. And he brings a proof for this from the Rambam in Hilchos Ritzeiach.